Siskiyou remains intact, and will this trend continue in this ancient sylvan paradise?
Coming up next.
Scattered to the winds by the violence of the 1967 Detroit race riots, an unusual group of almost all-white grade school students reunite in their 40s to discover how each of their lives had been profoundly impacted by their beloved African-American teacher, Mr. Bell. Only a reunion 35 years later could express the impact he had on their lives. Colorblind.
Tuesday at 8.
Real people, independent voices, untold stories.
I am not afraid. I am journalist. I am brave.
A window into the world. Local communities, global connections, new perspectives.
And we must take the power back.
See for yourself on Global Voices.
Tuesday at 9.
Coming soon to Independent Lens.
Origami is much more than a fascinating way to fold paper. It's an art form and a window into math, science, and nature that can reveal how the universe works. Meet the modern-day paper folders who are pushing origami further than ever before. Between the Folds.
Tuesday at 10.
Concertina. I'm thinking about the story I'm telling right here, right now, in this space.
Wednesday at 8.
This is what we were. This is where we've been. This is who we are.
The hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
This is our experience, the American experience.
Earthquakes, unpredictable and powerful killers.
We can't see earthquakes coming, that's the problem.
Can scientists predict the next killer quake before it's too late?
If I was standing right here, I would die.
Deadliest earthquakes on Nova.
Catch Nova tonight at 9.
Next time on Nature, Ellesmere Island, the high Arctic. For Falcon and Wolf, a challenging new season is about to begin.
Tonight at 10.
It's the end of August. In Ashland, Oregon, students at the Wilderness Charter School are preparing for their first 2 weeks of school. A backpacking trip into the wilderness.
Let's go.
They don't have far to go. Ashland is right on the edge of one of the world's most important temperate forest regions, the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion. This is a rugged, mountainous area on America's west coast, straddling the border between the states of Oregon and California. The ancient forest of the Klamath-Siskiyou is home to a great diversity of species, many of them rare and endangered. Some of its trees are very old and very large, growing here long before the first Europeans arrived. It's a place of fast-moving rivers and remote terrain where Bigfoot is said to dwell. Visitors come here from all over the world. But this region has also seen heavy logging of its valuable trees. And its rivers have been dammed in many places. But in spite of these sometimes drastic alterations to the landscape, more than a third of the Klamath-Siskiyou's old-growth forest remains. and long, wild stretches of river tumble freely through this land. How is it that much of the Klamath-Siskiyou remains intact? And will this trend continue in this ancient sylvan paradise? On the banks of the Rogue River, which flows through the heart of the Klamath-Siskiyou, a feast is being prepared to celebrate the return of the salmon as they make their annual migration up the river from the ocean. This gathering, held by Native Americans for thousands of years, is taking place on its traditional site, where a Takelma Indian village once stood. The keeper of the sacred salmon ceremony is Agnes Baker Pilgrim, the oldest living descendant of the Takelma Indians.
We prayed for the salmon people because my people believed that salmon looked like us, and they lived in beautiful cities below the ocean floor. And every spring and every fall, they took on the shape of the salmon to come back up the rivers and streams to feed us. And we pray that they hear us and that they will come back more and more to feed us.
The wild rivers that cut through this rugged land were once so full of salmon that it was said one could walk across the rivers on their backs. That's how it was when the first Europeans arrived in America. They found an abundance of immense forests, about 1 billion acres of them. Stands of mature trees, hundreds to thousands of years old, were widespread. On the west coast of North America, an unbroken forest stretched from California to Alaska. But by the 1800s, those trees were being steadily felled by a newly established timber industry, spurred on by the California gold rush. With the coming of the railroads in the early 1900s, the pace of logging operations greatly accelerated. After World War II, the Pacific Northwest saw another surge in logging to supply wood for house building. Clear cutting became common. But in the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion, enough of the big trees escaped logging that today one can still experience the magic of an old-growth forest.
Every day is different. In the forest, every day is different. So you begin to pick up on these differences, and all these differences are just stunningly beautiful. I've been here for 27 years, and I think anybody that's ever been in a forest will automatically fall in love with trees and all that goes with it. The forest is just teeming with thousands of life forms that can't exist without the forest. And in the long run, I don't believe that we can exist without the forest either.
One thing that I really love about this area is just the incredible biodiversity there is here.
Sophia Weiss grew up on the edge of the Klamath-Siskiyou.
It's been pretty amazing to be in such a diverse area. I didn't really know that until I got older, but I could see it visually. I think when I was a kid, I counted 35 different wildflowers just on a walk, one morning, and I lost track after that.
Once you're inside these old-growth forests, it's like being in a cathedral. They are extraordinarily diverse, rich places with giant trees. And think of the redwoods, for instance, would be the quintessential old-growth forest, enormous trees that have been on the landscape for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Forest ecologist Dominic Della Sala has studied temperate forests around the world.
One of the most important features of these older forests is they have a lot of dead stuff in them. And the dead trees, the snags as they're called, and the down logs are vital to the health of these forests. This is a very unique and rare forest that, because of all its richness, is serving as an oasis of life in the region. Nothing in those forests is wasted. Everything's recycled and everything has a unique purpose in that forest.
But in the Klamath-Siskiyou and throughout the Pacific Northwest, the importance of an intact forest has not always been recognized.
What was on this site at one point was a biological oasis, the old-growth forest at some time. And through logging, that forest was clear-cut. And now what we've got is a biologically sterile landscape that's lacking that richness of life that we had in the old forest. Because they took all of what were any big trees on this site originally, there's nothing to anchor the soils. So these soils are incredibly unstable. All I have to do is rub my boot here and it all wants to wind up downhill. Bottom of this hill is there's a creek. When you log that intensely across a landscape, the sediment eventually winds up in the creek. And because all creeks are connected to other creeks, that sediment winds up at some point in an area that is going to be spawning habitat for salmon and other fish. And we know that sediment tends to kill salmon spawning sites.
In the Pacific Northwest as a whole, the old-growth forest has been reduced to less than 20% of its original size. But this is not the case in the Klamath-Siskiyou, where more old growth has survived. The first reason for this is the nature of the land itself. The terrain here is rugged and remote.
Logging has been a disturbance in the Klamath-Siskiyou, but it's not to the degree that it has in a lot of areas that have been extremely clear-cut, where they've taken out the entire forest. A lot of the old-growth forests still exist in the Klamath Range, and most of that's due to the fact that it's too expensive to extract.
The terrain here is so jumbled that it is known as the Klamath Knot. This complex topography has not only hindered logging, but has created an especially diverse area for plants. Botanist Frank Callahan has spent many years exploring the forests of the Klamath-Siskiyou region.
This is a center for conifer diversity. There's about 38 or 39 species depending on whose count you take. In some areas, within a square mile, there are 17 species of conifers. You don't get that concentration anywhere else on the globe in a temperate situation. Basically, what makes this region so unique and why we have such a diverse flora here is we have a tremendous amount of diversity also in the geology.
That geologic diversity has long attracted geologists like Linda Tandy to the region. But much of the geologic story here is covered up by trees. So geologists have found that the best place to see rocks and read their fascinating tale is down by the rivers.
Okay, so here we are almost to the contact. This is the Gliese Formation, and then we should be able to find some pillow basalts here shortly.
Geologists have learned that the Klamath Mountains were created 150 million years ago when two gigantic plates of the Earth's crust came together. At an ancient shoreline, the Pacific Plate beneath the ocean dove underneath the North American continental plate, pushing up the rugged Klamaths. As the land rose, rivers sliced down, carving out steep-walled canyons that eventually terminate at the sea. This ancient terrain is much older than the conical peaks of the Cascade Range just to the east. Unlike these lofty volcanoes of the high Cascades, the mountains of the Klamath-Siskiyou are lower and favored by the milder climate of the coast. This has major implications for the region's plant communities.
This was close to a maritime source at all times. It didn't go through the heavy glaciation of most of the inland areas. The Cascade Range, for example, and the Sierra Nevada, which both took very severe glaciation. Our area was closer to the coast, and the climate was milder. Hence, the redwood stayed on here. So this is an area that's kind of set aside geologically and climatically from the rest of the region. And that's why we have the diversity we do.
Over time, this ancient sheltered terrain allowed the flourishing of some 3,500 plant species, a remarkable diversity. More than 200 of these evolved only here and nowhere else on Earth. Visitors are amazed by the size of the trees here. The tallest trees on Earth are found in this area.
This is an incense cedar, approximately 600 to 700 years old. And this specimen is a very large tree. You're not going to find another one like this anywhere else on the planet. In girth, this incense cedar is the largest known.
This very large incense cedar is still here today because it is in a protected wilderness area, the Red Buttes Wilderness. Protecting wildlands in the Klamath-Siskiyou began in the early 1900s when influential citizens urged lawmakers to preserve a small but very special place. It became the Oregon Caves National Monument in 1909.
You guys have 526 stairs that you will be climbing today. Most of these stairs are going to be rock, uneven, wet, slippery stairs, so please take your time when going up and down.
This cave has been carved out of marble by an underground stream. Fewer than 10% of the world's caves are marble. A short walk from the cave is a 1,000-year-old Douglas fir, one of the largest in Oregon. It is part of an old-growth forest that is protected in the monument. There are also meadows here and alpine lakes. But around the time the Oregon Caves National Monument was established, beyond its borders, logging was becoming big business. Eventually, thousands of people would end up working in the region's timber industry.
Logging was big business back there when I started. It was big business. And sure, I could have probably went into something else, but I didn't want to. You get up in the morning at 3:30 in the morning, you're on the job at crack of light. First tree hits the ground before the sun comes over the top of the tree. It's a great living. I loved it.
Find it? I think so. I think we're right here and we need to just go right up over there.
Okay.
All right.
As logging ramped up, so did the study of the region's biological characteristics.
Okay.
It wasn't long before scientists made an important discovery. The Klamath-Siskiyou was an extraordinary place biologically.
a sedum over here as well. Oh, yeah.
Biologists Susan Harrison and Ellen Damshin share the excitement of one of the plant pioneers, Robert Whitaker, as they re-examine sites that he first studied in the late 1940s.
Biologists have known for a long time, since at least the early 20th century, that the Klamath-Siskiyou region is very special. It's got tremendous diversity, unprecedented in Western North America in terms of forest diversity. Almost every type of forest that's found anywhere in Western North America is found here in the Klamath-Siskiyou region, and that's not true anywhere else. So Whitaker recognized that in his paper. He said basically that's why he wanted to come do his study here. Oh, we got a Lilium Bolandri. Do we have that already?
No, I don't think so. I'll write it down.
Many of the botanical samples in the study are hardy plants that grow on a smooth, greenish rock called serpentine.
I bet you if we look around, we'll find some more of that Collinsia. Is that it there? Yeah, that's
Collinsia. So small.
And very toasty. California and Southern Oregon altogether have over 200 species that are found only on serpentine. It's one of the world's richest regions for plant species found only on serpentine. And within that, the Klamath-Siskiyou region is the pinnacle. It's the richest part. Diversity is very, very high here. And right now we're sitting on the largest slab of serpentine and its parent rock peridotite anywhere in North America. It's about 20 or 25 miles across, very large and also very old. It's thought to be at least 50 million years old, which has given plants a lot of time to evolve.
Serpentine's nutrient-poor soil supports a rare and fascinating plant, a carnivorous plant called Darlingtonia californica.
Darlingtonia californica is this cool guy, otherwise known as the cobra lily, because it sort of has a snake-like look with the little flaps hanging out there. So this is the flowering stalk, and that's the fruit. You can see the remains of the flower here. And the carnivorous part is a modified leaf that's rolled up that has digestive juices inside.
Robert Whitaker's study brought the diversity and richness of the Klamath-Siskiyou to the attention of the scientific world. But would that recognition be enough to protect the forest from the wave of clear-cut logging aiming straight for it?
Whitaker did all of his sampling in 1949 to 51, just before the big wave of post-war logging hit the national forests around here. And in his paper, which wasn't published till 1960, he said, at the present rate, these forests that I'm telling you about are going to be gone within a few years. And he was absolutely right. They're gone.
But in other parts of the Klamath-Siskiyou, remnants of the old-growth forest endured, and the tide was turning in favor of protecting them. Prospects for protection lay in the fact that 2/3 of the forest land in the region was public land. Unlike the rest of the forest, which was owned privately, this land was owned by the American people, who had a say in how it was managed. It was administered on their behalf by the United States Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. But for years, these government agencies had worked with private timber and mining companies to extract natural resources from the public land. Jeff DeBonis worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 14 years.
My job was actually to provide timber to the industry. I was a timber sale planner. I'd go out and measure and mark trees and package them into a contract, a sale, and then we'd sell those sales to the timber industry, and they'd come in and cut them and haul them away. A lot of the people who worked in the Forest Service believed in even-age management, which is basically clear cutting. Their philosophy was that old-growth forests were decadent, unclean, not great trees, a forest that was dying. So what they liked to do was to replace what they considered decadent old-growth forests with fast-growing young plantations of single species of trees.
To gain access to the trees, the government built an extensive network of roads.
Forest Service was the largest road building entity on the planet for quite a few decades. Hundreds of thousands of miles of roads were built into the National Forest to access timber for logging. And all of those roads were paid by the American taxpayer. All of those roads were subsidized.
The roads had long-lasting effects that continue today.
Some of the biggest impacts from a logging operation are actually the roads. And this network of roads that we've got going through the region is a conduit for a lot of traffic. And with that traffic comes increased fire risks because there's a tendency to have accidental or arson-related fires in these forests. And the roads themselves funnel sediment down into the creeks, and those sediment in turn trap salmon, and all of that sediment runs into their spawning beds, and you eventually got fish problems.
In the 1960s, the American public began to insist that their forests do more than simply provide timber. The forest should also provide for recreation and maintain biodiversity, and be managed so that natural resources were used sustainably.
A shift happened, well, it started actually in the mid-60s, where Congress said, look, you're supposed to give value to all of the other uses of the forest on public lands. Start really paying attention to wildlife watershed values, the health of the soil, the health of the forest from a multiple use standpoint.
New laws were passed that reflected this shift in thinking about the forest. The one that best protected old-growth forest was the Wilderness Act, signed into law by President Johnson in 1964. This act required an inventory of all remaining wild, roadless areas in the national forests so that Congress could choose to protect them. Logging, mining, and motorized vehicles were outlawed in these areas. In the Klamath-Siskiyou, several wilderness areas were soon created. One of them was the Kalmiopsis Wilderness in southern Oregon. Fires caused by lightning have recently swept through the forests of this area. The impact of these fires looks severe, but fire is something that the Kalmiopsis is used to. In fact, the Kalmiopsis is one of the most diverse places in the Klamath-Siskiyou, at least partly because of its close, long-term relationship with fire. The region's largest wilderness was created in 1984, the Trinity Alps Wilderness in Northern California. Given how big and remote this wilderness is, it's not surprising that there have been reported sightings here of the giant, man-like creature known as Bigfoot. Northwest of the Trinity Alps, on the foggy Oregon coast, are the Grassy Knob and Copper Salmon wilderness areas. Like other wilderness areas, the Grassy Knob Wilderness gives people a way to lose themselves in wild nature.
I live in Bandon, Oregon, which is located about 20 miles north of here. My daughter Jennifer and I came down today to do a little walking in the forest. The thing that's attractive about this place is the size of the trees and the proliferation of the trees, lots of them, and so the green's nice, smells good. We spend a lot of time in the wilderness areas, and for me, it's a great experience. As I understand it, that's probably the purpose of wilderness areas, is to protect it so that people can experience what our forests were like years ago before we came in and did lots of logging. Yeah.
By the middle of the 1980s, 11 protected wilderness areas had been created in the Klamath-Siskiyou. They now form the largest complex of roadless areas on the Pacific coast, between Canada and Mexico. But heavy logging continued all around the protected lands.
Through the 80s, they continued to cut way too many trees, do too much clear cutting. A lot of species were starting to fail. It was beginning to show that the overcutting was having a big impact on the forest, on salmon, on wildlife species.
Biologists began to fear that the region's web of life was being dangerously disrupted and fragmented.
In the past, we have had a history of logging the old-growth forest at an unsustainable rate. And we've logged those forests so quickly that they can't replenish themselves. When you cut down a 1,000-year-old forest, which is biologically rich, and you replace that with a tree plantation, that tree plantation, first of all, doesn't have the same biological values, doesn't have the richness of life that you have in that older forest. And then that forest is cut again. So it never reaches those older characteristics that are associated with biologically rich forests.
By the end of the 1980s, the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest were in trouble, and some of the forest creatures were in danger of dying off. Wildlife biologists like Steve Andrews of Oregon State University began tracking one of those forest dwellers whose population was dwindling: the northern spotted owl. The scientific studies confirmed that the owl's population was declining to a dangerous level. This prompted lawsuits, which were brought on behalf of the spotted owl in the early 1990s. As a result, logging in the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest was brought to a virtual standstill.
The female should be basically on the bearing up slope here. A little ways though, just inside that stand over here. If we're lucky, this bird will be in that stand. Actually over there.
The spotted owl is emblematic of the decline of old-growth forests, and biologists have been studying the population status of the owl for many decades, and they've been able to monitor its downward spiral. The bird is on a trajectory towards extinction, largely because we've reduced its old-growth habitat to 15 to 20% of its original extent. And as goes the owl, so does the entire old-growth ecosystem, which is why the owl got so much attention as being the symbol for protecting the old-growth forest.
The owl and the other forest creatures were not the only ones affected by the destruction of the old-growth forest. It was becoming clear that the ancient forest had uses for people beyond simply providing wood products.
Old-growth forests are the air and water purification systems for everything we depend on. We are breathing the air that's been purified by the forest. We are drinking the water. Many of these watersheds, the reservoirs that we tap our water supply from, come from places that have intact forests that have been purifying the water that we're drinking.
The old-growth habitat of the northern spotted owl was at the center of a profound change in federal forest practices, away from unsustainable logging and toward maintaining biodiversity. But it was not an easy change for some people in the region.
There was a real fear, it was almost a palpable fear in this region that the economy was going to absolutely collapse. There was a belief at that time that the timber industry performed the base on which the rest of all economic activity rested, so that restaurants and lawyers and laundromats and you name it sat on top of that timber industry, and that the timber industry was hence the basic industry for the overall economy of this region. And so there's a fear that if that base were to crumble somehow, the entire economy would collapse down and there would just be rubble, and we would see signs of the last one out, turn out the lights. It didn't happen.
When they shut the mills down here, yeah, it put a lot of people out. But it picked back up. I mean, everybody went and done their thing. They're all young enough to do that. Lots of them had better educations to go somewhere else. And then a lot of them got another education to go in other directions too.
What happened 20 years ago is that this region managed the forest as though the only thing that mattered was converting the trees into lumber and other forest products. We now very consciously recognize that there are other goods and services that also generate jobs, that also contribute to economic well-being. The economy has evolved so that it's a very complex economy. There are people participating in all sorts of industries. So you have people participating in a tourism industry associated with, say, the Shakespearean Festival. Some of them are associated with people rafting down the Rogue River and the like, doing a whole host of things.
The region continued to be a major producer of wood products. Most of the mills retooled to take in smaller diameter logs, the majority coming from private lands. On public lands, the emphasis shifted away from logging and toward other uses of the forest, such as recreation. This shift, instead of destroying the economy, actually improved it and made it more sustainable.
Business is very good. There is something about getting back to nature. Moms and dads want their kids to see the region, sleep in a sleeping bag, jump in the river and swim. And there's just that whole environment and getting back out to nature and enjoying that. There's definitely a change in the business environment within the region. The economy here for the last 100 years has been logging based, and that everybody, one way or another, makes their living from the trees that are logged out of this region. We're seeing that shift now into more of an ecotourism mode, in that we do live in a beautiful region, and maybe that's the product we should be selling instead of what we're cutting out of the forest.
To preserve its ecological integrity, the Rogue River became one of the first rivers in the United States to be protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. This limits development along the lower half of the river and creates a protected corridor on either side of it.
There's a very big reason why we really want to protect this wild corridor is, besides just the natural beauty, there's an economic impact here, and that people come from all over the world to enjoy this region, to see what's here, and to take that snapshot in their head of the memories that they have here.
I've been working as a guide for 3 years now. I love meeting the people that come through, and most of the time I get people that have never experienced a rafting trip, let alone been on the river before, so it's really fun to see the excitement that comes through them after the river trip, and just the fact that we're outdoors on the river. It's very beautiful.
The big issue right now at the river and long-term health of the river is we really need logging to actually be stopped before it encroaches right onto the border of the Wild and Scenic Corridor. If you take out trees, we lose our shade, and in turn warms up the tributaries, which then in turn warms up the river. We really need to protect the river and keep it in its natural state for the next generations to come.
There are other rivers in the region that are also designated wild and scenic. The Smith River in California is one of them. 325 miles of the Smith River are designated wild and scenic, more miles than any other river in the country. The Illinois River, a tributary of the Rogue, is also wild and scenic. In fact, the Klamath-Siskiyou region has the greatest concentration of wild and scenic rivers in the United States. But although these rivers are considered wild and scenic, these days there are far fewer salmon in their waters than there once were. Beyond the heavy fishing of the past, a major problem in modern times is a series of dams on at least parts of these rivers, which divert water for agriculture and electricity. The dams also block the salmon who need to swim upriver to spawn. A focus of this problem is the Klamath River. It once had the third largest run of salmon on the Pacific coast. It is now dammed in 6 places, and its fish population is down to a fraction of its historic levels. But local residents are doing something about it.
I think it's 16 to 12.
16 to 12?
Yep.
Is that right, John? We got 16 to 12 next?
Yeah.
Who's next?
Petey Brucker is the founder of the Salmon River Restoration Council in Sawyers Bar, California.
Crew leaders go with Natty, and then I'll give you an overview of what we're doing here. What we're doing here today is we're counting fish. The spring run salmon are almost gone in the Klamath Basin. Historically, they think there used to be 100,000 to 1 million of them. And the Salmon River is basically the last run in the Klamath Basin. And so when we learned that there's not many of them left, folks started surveying them, looking for them 28 years ago. And now we're basically going to tell you how many there are this year. We're hoping for 1,000 or more. And when you think there used to be 100,000 or 1 million, that's hardly any. In 2005, we counted 90. So this is almost extinct. And these fish need help. One of the ways to get them help is to look at them, notice them, and talk about them.
There could have been tens of thousands in a stretch of a tributary like this, and right now we're dealing with hundreds to low thousands. So you can see between 1 order to 2 order of magnitudes less of fish than there were historically. So we've got a long way to go to get back to things where they were historically. As we approach areas where we think there are fish, the crew spreads out and we'll send some people below a pool or an area where we think there's fish holding. Then we'll move through very carefully to try to disturb the fish as little as possible. We're looking for adult fish, which are extremely large. Once you see them underwater, it's quite an impressive sight. You never forget it, especially when you're in close proximity to them.
The juvenile fish are born in freshwater. They then develop and they migrate to the saltwater in the ocean. And then they live for about 3 or 4 years out there. And then they'll come back as adults. They'll swim all the way up. For us, it's over 100 miles. They need to have cool pools all summer to sit in, to hold, all summer for 2 or 3 or 4 months. And they don't eat, they don't do anything, they just sit there and wait until the right conditions happen, and then they'll go and spawn. The Salmon River is one of the few rivers left in the Klamath that have cool pools all summer. That's why we still have spring run here. Many of the other rivers, either the channels have been altered so the pools aren't there anymore, or a lot of logging or mining and things like that basically pushed a lot of sediment into the pools and filled them up. Some of the different farming practice that uses a lot of water de-water some of these places. And so there aren't that many places like the Salmon River left in the Klamath Basin, or most places.
Salmon has long been the primary food source for local Native American tribes on the Klamath, just as it was on the Rogue River. It has been the basis of their cultural and spiritual well-being.
For the Karuk people, this is the last stronghold of the spring salmon, something that's very important to the Karuk people. This used to be the major run that our people used to depend on over time. There's been a dramatic decline in this fishery since I've become involved in this world. The dams, the last dam put in this Klamath River complex, cut off that remaining stronghold in the upper basin, or upper mid-Klamath, of the spring salmon population. So it has a big impact on our way of life.
All right, Will, you made it back alive.
Yeah.
See any fish?
Yeah, we saw a lot of fish out there today.
Did you?
Very cool.
Yeah, we got 94 adult springers.
Yes.
We got 34 jacks.
And how many steelhead half pounders?
13.
And did you have a good time?
Oh, it was wonderful.
Excellent. For spring Chinook, we had 756 adults, 253 jacks, for a total of 1,009 spring Chinook. We were hoping maybe we'd have a record year and get more than ever, but it looks like we're just gonna have a decent year, so.
Today, many people who care about salmon and their habitat, from scientists to fishermen to tribal members, are working to remove dams from the Klamath. This is not a pipe dream. In fact, dams are already being removed elsewhere in the region from the Rogue River.
Right now in the Rogue Valley, there's actually 3 dams being removed or fish passage provided. I think a lot of people would not realize just how monumental this time is. You know, to see this happening on the Rogue River where we have multiple dams being removed, you'll be hard-pressed to find that happening anywhere else in the U.S. This is the removal of the Gold Hill Dam. Basically, it's the number 2 fish passage barrier on the Rogue River.
The number 1 fish passage barrier is the Savage Rapids Dam, also being removed.
Having known what the Rogue Valley has gone through, where it was primarily a logging-based community in Valley and here, and that was the sole source of income for the most part. And having seen in my lifetime it transform into more of a tourist type area where rafting and fishing are major industries. And the Rogue River is kind of the gem of the whole valley. And to see the dams coming out, that's just going to provide that much more recreational activities that are available to people to come and enjoy. It really is a historic event. Anybody getting a chance to see this will remember it for the rest of their lives because it'll never look the same again.
Other changes have come to the region. For one thing, the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument has been established in southern Oregon. This area acts as a land bridge that allows wildlife to migrate between the Cascade Range, inland, and the Siskiyou Mountains to the west. 4 geologic provinces come together here, creating a richly diverse, unusually colorful landscape. Another change taking place in the Pacific Northwest has long-term implications for the future. A new generation of foresters is learning about advances in science so they can better manage the western forests.
Where we have a long-term continuing measurement of the carbon flux between the forest and the atmosphere.
University of Washington professor Jerry Franklin is internationally known for his work in old-growth forests.
Well, I've been in the forestry business now, the forest science business, for about 50 years. And the changes that I've seen in our understanding of these forests and how they work is absolutely incredible. Our policies on our public lands have just changed dramatically, and what we've come to appreciate is the array of ecological services that these forests provide in a natural condition, in terms of providing for biodiversity and providing for excellent watershed protection and sustaining the soil.
Old-growth forests provide another crucial service, one that is of global significance.
They're also great at absorbing the carbon that our automobiles are putting out into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. They act as giant carbon sponges, and they take up that carbon, they store it for long periods of time, and they're essential in the efforts to combat global warming.
This forest has huge mass of carbon, hundreds of metric tons of carbon stored, sequestered away from the atmosphere. And young forest has essentially none. Old-growth forest represents the greatest store of carbon of any ecosystem in the world. There isn't another forest type, there isn't another vegetation type that sequesters as much carbon as one of our Pacific Northwest old-growth forests. It's just huge. This is where our opportunity really is to sequester carbon, not in young forest, but by retaining the old forest we have, or actually growing some of our middle-aged forest to older forest. That would be a very effective way of storing more carbon.
But in spite of their carbon-storing capacity, mature trees are still being felled on privately owned land in the Klamath-Siskiyou. About a third of the region's forest lands are privately owned.
What's not talked about, and what is a major problem, especially as we look into the 21st century, is that at the present time, private lands are cut much more heavily than public lands. And there's very little restriction in terms of how those lands are logged. They can still clear cut basically as much as they want. To have an ecologically sound forest, the private lands also need to be managed in a sustainable way, and they're not.
This means that for now, the old-growth forest on the public lands of the Klamath-Siskiyou offers the best hope for keeping carbon out of the Earth's atmosphere. But even on public lands, in spite of the strong scientific evidence in favor of protecting it, much of the ancient forest of the Klamath-Siskiyou is at risk. Only a quarter of the region's old-growth forest is fully protected in wilderness areas and parks. And there is still logging of unprotected stands.
I think there'll always be pressure on the national forests to cut timber by industry. A lot of the old growth would be at risk unless the agency is capable of withstanding the pressure.
Or unless Congress permanently protects the old-growth forest in new wilderness areas, parks, or national monuments. This would have little effect on the nation's timber supply. Nationwide, the national forests and other public lands only provide about 8% of America's timber.
One of the concerns people have is where are we going to get our wood if we stop logging on national forests? At the present time, national forests contribute very little in terms of percentage of wood products that Americans use. We don't do a very good job of recycling. There's a lot of room for the U.S. to reduce what it uses to recycle and lessen the pressure and need for cutting timber. National forests are far more valuable for the ecological services that they provide in terms of watershed protection, fisheries, wildlife habitat, clean air. Those are much more valuable services coming from our national forests than timber products.
Over the years, the exploitation of resources has disturbed the natural rhythms of the Klamath-Siskiyou. Yet large stands of old-growth forests, with their magnificent trees and free-flowing rivers, have been saved. Today, this ecoregion is one of the last great strongholds of old-growth forest in America. Whether it remains so largely depends on what happens to its wild lands that are still unprotected. As students from the Wilderness Charter School camp under trees that are hundreds of years old and swim in rivers with migrating salmon, the ancient forests around them abound with fascinating lessons, old and new. So much can now be understood about these forests and how they help sustain life on the planet, and what spending time in a wild forest can mean.
One thing that I've been really fortunate to have is access to the natural world. I'm a really strong believer in experiencing the natural world, especially roadless and wilderness areas, just because you get such a different sense of a more true world. Not that our regular world is untrue, but it's completely different, and it can draw one closer to a deeper understanding of oneself and also our place in the world and what we really want to do with our lives. There's this certain sort of contemplation one can have in the natural world, away from everything. Just to be removed completely from our everyday lives. It's such a gift.
unpredictable and powerful killers.
We can't see earthquakes coming, that's the problem.
Can scientists predict the next killer quake before it's too late?
If I was standing right here, I would die.
Deadliest earthquakes on Nova.
Coming up next.
Scattered to the winds by the violence of the 1967 Detroit race riots, an unusual group of almost all-white grade school students reunite in their 40s to discover how each of their lives had been profoundly impacted by their beloved African-American teacher, Mr. Bell. Only a reunion 35 years later could express the impact he had on their lives. Colorblind.
Tuesday at 8. Real people, independent voices, untold stories.
I'm not